is John Fitzgerald Kennedy's 100th birthday. Should we give a cheer? It is also the 50th anniversary of the creation of the birthplace as a unit of the National Park Service. I think that deserves a cheer. The Park Service has been privileged to care for this Beale Street house and to research and convey to our visitors the important story of JFK's youth in Brookline and that of the early years of his remarkable family. The full story of his presidency is well told at the JFK Library, but as fewer and fewer visitors to the site come knowing anything about JFK except for his assassination, we have sought to provide them with some context to relay more about his presidency and link the story of his early years to his later achievements. JFK's speeches have been a critical link in helping us tell this larger story. When you view our new introductory film for the site, we're very proud of it. We hope you like it. You will see that we have used his speeches to help explain his significance to our visitors. So many decades later, they remain fresh, vigorous in language, and rich in relevant content. His speeches are handed down to us as a significant part of the JFK legacy, just as this house and its contents have been given to us. And the next hour today is our small effort to point to that legacy and to help his words become more fully appreciated and take root in our 20th century culture. Today we will hear segments from some of his most important speeches delivered by distinguished readers who've been so kind to join us, read passages, and share their thoughts on the significance of JFK and of his words. In your program you will find information on our speakers, some. Let me introduce them briefly now as a group and refer you to the internet for all the interesting details about them. We have Governor Mike Dukakis with us. Unfortunately, Kitty is not there. We were thrilled to know that we would have both of them, but we're absolutely delighted to have you, and we have her in spirit, we think. And when he accepted, he said, because both of them felt that their lives in public service had really been inspired by JFK. We have Professor Eldon Lim of the National University of Singapore. We have Professor Dava Newman of MIT and former Deputy Administrator of NASA. Retired Judge Nancy Gertner and John Reinstein, former legal director of the ACLU of Massachusetts. We have State Senator Cynthia Stone Cream. We have Brookline Selectman Bernard Green. And we have Juliet Kayyem on the faculty of the Kennedy School and a TV and radio commentator, among other roles. We're so grateful to them for being with us today and for taking the time to think about JFK and what JFK means to them, and to look over the speeches that they're reading. Yes, that does deserve applause. A round of applause for all. So I'd like to begin with Governor Dukakis.
I'm not announcing anything. sends her regrets. 2 days before the holiday, both of us came down with terrible colds and coughs. And I'm really kind of infectious and should be here, but one of us had to show up. So she sends her best and regrets. She really wanted very much to be here, so I brought our son John with me, who was 5 at the time of the assassination. He remembers that to this very day. Now, let me just say briefly, because we're all supposed to be brief, that there's a little context to what I'm about to read. This is the famous City on the Hill speech, which he delivered 11 days before his inauguration. Went to the State House and delivered this speech. He didn't say this, and there wasn't much commentary about it, but you have to understand that Massachusetts in 1961 was one of the 3 or 4 most corrupt states in the country. In fact, when I ran the following year, and I knocked on every door in this town, people would often say to me, "You look honest, I'll vote for you." That was all it took. Finally called my mother and said, "Ma, thanks for creating a kid that at least looks honest," whatever that meant. I don't know. But I'm serious, it was that bad. And so, as I read this excerpt, just understand that he never says it specifically, but it was quite obvious that he was trying to say to state government in Massachusetts, "Don't embarrass me. I'm going down to Washington to run an administration that stands for integrity and intelligence and vision, and I don't need this millstone around my neck." So listen to these words carefully. "I have welcomed the opportunity to address this historic body," that's the legislature, "and through you, the people of Massachusetts, to whom I am so deeply indebted for a lifetime of friendship and trust. For 14 years, I have placed my confidence in the citizens of Massachusetts. They have generously responded by placing their confidence in me. Now, on the Friday after next, I am to assume new and broader responsibilities. But I'm not here to bid farewell to Massachusetts. For 43 years, wherever I was, in London, Washington, the South Pacific, or elsewhere, this has been my home, and God willing, wherever I serve, this shall remain my home. It was here my grandparents were born. It is here, I hope, my grandchildren will be born. I speak neither from false provincial pride nor from artful political flattery. For no man about to enter high office in this country can ever be unmindful of the contribution this state has made to our national greatness. Its leaders have shaped our destiny long before the great republic was born. Its principles have guided our footsteps in times of crisis as well as in times of calm. Its democratic institutions, including this historic body, it's the legislature again, have served as beacon lights for other nations as well as for our sister states. For what, he didn't forget the Greeks, for what Pericles said to the Athenians has long been true of this Commonwealth. And by the way, both he and Bobby quoted liberally for the Greeks. I just wanted you to understand that. For what Pericles said to the Athenians has long been true of this Commonwealth. We do not imitate, for we are a model to others. And so it is that I carry with me from this state to that high and lonely office to which I now succeed, more than fond memories of firm friendships, the enduring qualities of Massachusetts, the common threads woven by the Pilgrim and the Puritan, the fisherman and the farmer, the Yankee and the immigrant will not be and could not be forgotten in this nation's executive mansion. They are an indelible part of my life, my convictions, my view of the past, and my hopes for the future. Allow me to illustrate. During the last 60 days, I have been at the task of constructing an administration. It has been a long and deliberate process. Some have counseled greater speed, others have counseled more expedient tests. But I have been guided by the standard John Winthrop set before his shipmates on the flagship Arbella 331 years ago, as they too faced the task of building a new government on a perilous frontier. We must always consider, he said, that we shall be as a city upon a hill, the eyes of all people are upon us. Today, the eyes of all people are truly upon us and our governments, in every branch, at every level, national, state, and local. Must be as a city upon a hill, constructed and inhabited by men, no women mentioned. Interesting. That's what people said in the time. But anyway, inhabited by men aware of their great trust and their great responsibilities. And I can always say, folks, that John Kennedy was an enormous inspiration to me and thousands of us who followed him. For me, of course, he was a Brookline kid. He had done great work, and he was a model for the kind of public servant that I thought those of us who sought public office should shoot for. And I can't say enough for the kind of inspiration he provided for us and for so many of us who, largely as a result of that man, decided to run for elective office. It's his 100th birthday, but we'll never forget it.
I'm a presidential scholar, and I'm here to read excerpts from John F. Kennedy's inaugural address. This inaugural address, I should say, has become the standard by which we judge presidential eloquence, at least in the modern age. It is an exemplary inaugural address because it was gracious and nonpartisan. It took words very seriously, and its content was actually substantive and sensible. Breath of fresh air, isn't it? Let me then read an excerpt from this great address delivered on a crisp afternoon in January 1961. In your hands, my fellow citizens, more than mine, will rest the final success or failure of our cause. Since this country was founded, each generation of Americans have been summoned to give testimony to its national loyalty. The graves of young Americans who answered the call to service surround the globe. Now the trumpet summons us again, not as a call to bear arms, though arms we need, not as a call to battle, though embattled we are, but a call to bear the burden of a long twilight struggle, year in and year out, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, a struggle against the common enemies of man, tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself. Can we forge against these enemies a grand and global alliance, north and south, east and west, that can assure a more fruitful life for all mankind? Will you join us in that historic effort? In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shirk from this responsibility. I welcome it. I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring in this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it, and the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And now finally the famous bits that we all know. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. Finally, whether you are citizens of America or citizens of the world, ask of us here that same high standards of strength and sacrifice which we ask of you. With a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking his blessing and his help, but knowing that here on earth God's work must truly be our own. This, as you have now heard, has been the gold standard of inaugural addresses in our time, and I suggest for three particular reasons. First, it was gracious and non-partisan. Kennedy was a Democratic president replacing a Republican president, a young man replacing an experienced general. He himself had won a very narrow victory, and his own party had lost seats in the House. It was for this reason that John Kennedy consciously sought to write a unifying speech, one that was devoid of partisanship and divisiveness. To this end, and very unusually, his entire inaugural address was about foreign policy. There was no mention of domestic policy that was very contentious at the time, civil rights in particular, actually still contentious, and he decided not to talk about it in the inaugural address. Kennedy understood, however, that the inaugural address is not a victory lap. It is a sacred address, where the president performs his role less as a politician or commander-in-chief, and more as head of state, a prophet, a priest rehearsing the country's civil religion and shared values. The address, therefore, was not about him or his victory or his administration, but about America, the story and lineage that links all the presidents from George Washington through Abraham Lincoln, through Franklin Roosevelt, and now with us in a historical and mythical arc. When we say a president needs to be presidential, we take the countenance of Kennedy in this speech as the defining standard. The second reason why this speech was so eloquent was because it took words very seriously. Kennedy and his speechwriters understood that words are not just slogans or tweets. They carry important ideas. Words can move mountains. They create alliances. They can also end alliances. Like his hero Winston Churchill, with whom he used to orate along on the I Can Hear It Now vinyl records, Kennedy understood the gravity of words in a nuclear age. Third and finally, this speech was eloquent and it took words seriously, ironically, not because it was crafted by speechwriters or spinmeisters, but by policy experts. The major speechwriter to help to draft this speech was actually Ted Sorensen, who was his special counsel. This is the critical difference between the speech-making worlds of John Kennedy and our own. In 1969, a major institutional development would change the White House speechwriting apparatus forever. For then, during the Nixon administration, the Office of Speechwriting was created, thereby differentiating the ideas and policy people from the wordsmiths. Ted Sorensen was both, that's my point. In 1969, this was forever disaggregated between the speechwriters, the spinmeisters, and the policy experts. This division of labor was not in Ted Sorensen's, nor in my mind, the most benign development. Because Kennedy's speech was written by policy experts who understood the complexities of the Cold War, its content was sensible and well thought out, directed by policy rather than by style or rhetoric. As it turns out, great speeches also communicate great ideas. And so to conclude, on all three fronts, the inaugural address as gracious and non-partisan first. Second, the inaugural address as taking words seriously rather than cavalierly. And third, the inaugural address as content-heavy and policy-focused. John Kennedy gave us a masterclass in presidential eloquence. He's a model statesmanship that remains pertinent even today on the centenary of his birth. I'd like now to introduce Professor Dava Newman for the next reading.
Good afternoon, everyone. On September 12, 1962, President Kennedy delivered a speech describing his goals for the nation's space effort to a crowd of 35,000 at the Rice University Stadium. It's my great pleasure and honor to read from this speech. This country was conquered by those who moved forward, and so will space. William Bradford, speaking in 1630 of the founding of the Plymouth Bay Colony, said that all great and honorable actions are accompanied by great difficulties, and both must be enterprised and overcome with answerable courage. It is, if this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that humanity, in our quest for knowledge and progress, are determined and cannot be deterred. The exploration of space will go ahead, whether we join in it or not. And it is one of the greatest adventures of all time, and no nation which expects to be the leader of other nations can expect to stay behind in their race for space. Those who came before us made certain that this country rode the first waves of the industrial revolutions, the first waves of modern invention, and the first wave of nuclear power. And this generation does not intend to founder in the backwash of the coming age of space. We mean to be part of it. We mean to lead it. For the eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon, and to the planets beyond. And we have vowed that we shall not see it governed by a hostile flag of conquest, but by a banner of freedom and peace. We have vowed that we shall not see space filled with weapons of mass destruction, but with instruments of knowledge and understanding. Yet the vows of this nation can only be fulfilled if we in this nation are first, and therefore we intend to be first. In short, our leadership in science and in industry, our hopes for peace and security, our obligations to ourselves as well as others, all require us to make this effort to solve these mysteries, to solve them for the good of humanity, and to become the world's leading spacefaring nation. We set sail on this new sea because there is new knowledge to be gained and new rights to be won. And they must be won and used for the progress of all people. For space science, like nuclear science and all technology, has no consequence, no conscience of its own. Whether it will become a force of good or ill depends on humans. And only the United States occupies a position of preeminence. Can we decide whether this new ocean will be the sea of peace or of terrifying theater of war? I do not say that we should or will go unprotected against a hostile misuse of space any more than we will go unprotected against the hostile use of land or sea. But I do say that space may be explored and mastered without feeding the fires of war, without repeating the mistakes that man has made in extending his writ around the globe of ours. There is no strife, no prejudice, no conflict in outer space as of yet. Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of humanity, and its opportunity for peaceful cooperation may never come again. But why, say some, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? And why does Rice play Texas in football? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept and we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win. Personally now, that's my favorite speech ever given. President Kennedy's vision and leadership was paramount taught me to dream and taught me that anything was attainable, that we should, each one of us, reach for our dreams and reach for the stars. That exploration is truly one of the great adventures of all time, and it brings us all together. Making my career choice as an aerospace engineer, from being a small girl in Helena, Montana, growing up, and hearing the speech and seeing the Mercury and Gemini and Apollo programs and what we could truly attain was the inspiration for my entire career. That exploration really offers humanity a banner of freedom and peace. That if we vow that we shall not see space filled with weapons of mass destruction, but it is with the instruments of knowledge and understanding for all humankind. My entire career has been dedicated to teaching, exploration, and the dream of humanity becoming an interplanetary species. It was my distinct pleasure to have recently served in the Obama administration and tried to keep the words and the hope of JFK's legacy and inspiration going. So I'm inspired every day by President Kennedy's legacy and reminder, I quote, that we do choose to go to the moon in this decade, in my best Boston accent, in this decade, and do the other things. Again, not because that they are easy, but because distinctly that they are hard, and that we've served to reach our humanity's potential and lift us all up, all together. So it's my distinct pleasure to be here. Thank you. And now, with my pleasure, I'd like to introduce Nancy Gertner and John Rangstein.
In 1963, civil rights protests became increasingly confrontational in Alabama, with police harshly crushing protests in Birmingham. In June of 1963, Alabama Governor George Wallace refuses to allow 2 black students to enter the University of Alabama, forcing President Kennedy to use the National Guard to ensure the safety of the students. On June 11th, President Kennedy made the decision to give a televised evening speech announcing his civil rights proposal. Here are some passages from this speech.
We do a lot of this back and forth.
Right.
Civil rights was not a new issue in 1963, but the addition of the moral force of the president's voice was not to be denied. This is what President Kennedy began with. He said, "This is not a sectional issue. Difficulties over segregation and discrimination exist in every city, in every state of the Union, producing in many cities a rising tide of discontent that threatens the public safety. Nor is this a partisan issue. In a time of domestic crisis, men of goodwill and generosity should be able to unite regardless of party or politics. This is not even a legal or legislative issue alone. It is better to settle these matters in the courts than on the streets, and new laws are needed at every level, but law alone cannot make men see right. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures, and it is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public schools available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who will represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free. Okay.
Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them. The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, north and south, where legal remedies are not at hand. Redress is sought in the streets in demonstrations, parades, and protests, which create tensions and threaten violence and threaten lives. We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country and as a people. It cannot be met by repressive police action. Let me repeat that. It cannot be met by repressive police action. It cannot be left to increase demonstrations in the streets. It cannot be quieted by token moves or talk. It's time to act in the Congress, in your state and local legislative body, and above all, in all our daily lives. It's not enough to pin the blame on others, to say this is a problem of one section of the country or another, or deplore the facts that we face. A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all. Those who do nothing are inviting shame as well as violence. Those who act boldly are recognizing right as well as reality.
On November 22nd, 1963, I was a junior in college and had, I think, the same stunned and pained reaction that people across the country had. Wanted to do something. What could I do? I jumped in a car with three of my friends and drove 400 miles to Washington, D.C., simply to wait in line to walk through the Capitol Rotunda to see the closed casket and to stand on the streets of Washington as the funeral cortege passed by and to say goodbye. Why? I grew up in a segregated city, Washington, D.C. Not segregated by law, but by practice, by tradition, and in fact. It was, as yet, we thought that Brown v. Board of Education was for Southern states, for America's peculiar brand of apartheid. But in fact, as President Kennedy noted, it was a system that we face across the country. Segregation and inequality were not new in 1963, but leadership on the issue from the White House was. I really don't remember President Kennedy's speech that we just read from. I remember the incident, the occurrence which gave rise to it. What I do remember is actually President Johnson's speech in 1964, in which he said that the greatest tribute that we could pay to President Kennedy was the enactment of the Civil Rights Act, which became the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and ultimately the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That these were the tribute that we could pay was to endorse the enforcement of civil rights and to move forward to ensure the equality of all people. It still is.
Friday, November 22nd, 1963. I was a freshman at Barnett College. It was the Friday before Thanksgiving. I was looking forward to a break from all the stresses of freshman year. Word suddenly spread from one end of the campus to the other. We dropped everything and ran to the coffee lounge. It was the only place that even had a radio. I looked everywhere for my older sister, who was a senior at Barnett at the time, and we wept. We wept that day. We wept over the next 3 or 4 days. I had not been involved in Kennedy's campaigns. I had only been in high school, but it was the backdrop of our lives. It was the voice on the radio. It was the text in the newspapers. But after his death crystallized for me the life that I wanted to lead. It became the backdrop for our activism against the war in Vietnam. It became the backdrop for our activism in favor of women's rights. And in particular, the law that he made possible, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, became the backdrop of my legal career. The line in the speech about this is principally a moral issue is the cutting line for me. It is a moral issue that cuts across class and party and partisanship and time and epoch. It is the single moral crisis of our country. The demands of that moral crisis are the demands of every generation, especially our own. After crying for many days, I remember going to my freshman English class, and I will never forget what she said. She said to all of us downtrodden in the class, she said, "You may not have been involved directly in his campaign, you may not have directly worked for him, but he was yours. He was the first presidential candidate who belonged to your generation." And she said, "I understand your pain." Now, many, many years later, we have the privilege of living in the second Kennedy home, the home that JFK lived in between the ages of 4 and 10, and the singular privilege of living in the home where Robert Kennedy was born. This is a memory to be cherished. His is a model not to be forgotten, especially now. Senator Cynthia Cream.
Thank you very much. Before I start, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that the Massachusetts legislature is not totally corrupt now. And I would want you to know that it was with awe that I can say in my heart, and unbelievable, that President John Kennedy, Michael Dukakis, and Cynthia Cream are Brookline kids. So thank you for having me here today. With that, I will be reading an excerpt from the commencement address that President Kennedy gave at American University on June 10th of 1963. It begins. "I have therefore chosen this time and this place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth is too rarely perceived. Yet it is the most important topic on earth, world peace. What kind of peace do I mean? What kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women, not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time. I speak of peace because of the new face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age when great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces and refuse to surrender without resort to those forces. It makes no sense in an age when a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force delivered by all the Allied air forces in the Second World War. It makes no sense in an age when the deadly poisons produced by a nuclear exchange could be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn. Today, the expenditure of billions of dollars every year on weapons acquired for the purpose of making sure we never need to use them is essential to keeping the peace. But surely, the acquisition of such idle stockpiles, which can only destroy and never create, is not the only, much less the most efficient means of assuring peace. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary rational end of rational men. I realize that the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently, the words of the pursuer fall on deaf ears. But we have no more urgent tasks. Some say that it is useless to speak of world peace, or world law, or world disarmament, and that it will be useless unless the leaders of the Soviet Union adopt a more enlightened attitude. I hope they do. I believe that we can help them to do it. But I also believe we must re-examine our own attitude as individuals and as a nation, for our attitude is as essential as theirs. And every graduate of this school, every thoughtful citizen who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace should begin by looking inward, by examining his own attitude toward the possibilities of peace, toward the Soviet Union, toward the course of the Cold War, and toward freedom and peace here at home. Let us examine our attitude towards peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But as that is dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to conclusions that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need to accept that view. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be saved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. So let us preserve. Peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. So I was asked to think about this as well, and I would say that after thinking about this, it made me realize that he was telling me and all of us to reach for the stars. A lot has changed in the world since President Kennedy gave this speech. And while we are still struggling to attain the peace that so implorably speak of, we cannot afford to let go of this goal. But today, the pathway to peace has become more complicated. For us and the Soviet Union are not the only players, and nuclear war is not the only threat. We now face acts of aggression on our soil, not only from those within our country, but foreign and even unknown aggressors. We know the President's views were framed and grounded in his own personal experience in World War II, including the loss of his older brother and his own serious injuries. As he and his family have done, the Kennedys have challenged each of us to take an active role in a pathway to peace, be it the Peace Corps, the National Service Corps, and any other avenue dedicated to make the world a better and safer place. It is my hope that once again our country's leaders will sincerely take up this goal, as difficult as it may be, and work honestly towards lasting peace around the world, rather than drag us further into a world fraught with division, hate, and violence. As President Kennedy said, peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable. Let us hold on to President Kennedy's words of hope that the future of peace is possible, and recommit to this goal for a safer and better future for this generation and for all those to come. Thank you for asking. It is my pleasure to introduce Bernard Green. I'd like to say just a few words about him. Respectful, thoughtful, civic leader, lawyer, progressive voice for community betterment and social justice. Our own Brookline Selectman, Bernard Green.
Thank you, Senator Cream. Will you please write that down? I need that. Okay, I'm going to be reading from a speech that is not famous, but it is important. It's about the responsibilities of Americans to our natural environment and to all of our people. I selected this speech because I actually was there listening to it. My father was stationed at a local Air Force base, and I was a student at East Junior High School in Great Falls, Montana. Kennedy was on a conservation tour of the West, and he gave this speech on a beautiful fall day at the Memorial Stadium of the high school in Great Falls on September 26, 1963. The speech used what I would call 1960s style Cold War rhetoric, the political correctness of the day. He said America must throw their weight into the balance in every struggle, in every country, on the side of freedom. That was how we talked back then. But in this speech, Kennedy also directly asked the people of Montana and the people of America to support other struggles that must be fought to make America strong. Improving education, eliminating poverty, and what I'm going to focus in my reading, conservation of our natural resources, which the National Park Service is very concerned with, especially today. The way he delivered the conservation message in the passage that I will read speaks directly to us today in 2017 with respect to future generations that will come after us. So the speech goes, the passage goes, we go to Jackson Hole in Yellowstone and we are impressed, as all of us are. But what we should remember is that that was due to the work of others, not to us, but to those who made the great fight in the last 50 years. Now, in the 1960s, we have to decide what we are going to do. And I believe that there is a good deal that we can do. We have started on a project, a concentrated project of resource development. More watershed projects have been completed in recent years than ever before in our history. Negotiations are underway which should lead and must lead to the final ratification of the Columbia River Treaty with Canada. It has moved into its last stages, and it is my hope that work will soon be commenced on the Libby Dam project in northwest Montana, which will make this a richer state in which to live. And what you have done here in this section of the United States, I want us to do along our coastline. Only 2% of our extraordinary coastline, the Atlantic, the Gulf Stream, and the Pacific, only 2% is devoted to public use. We have the same fight along our coastlines that we had here in this section of the Northwest 30 and 40 years ago for forests and parks and all the rest. The fact of the matter is, we passed in 1 year, in 1961, 3 parks along our seashores, which is more than had been done in 1 year in any Congress in history. Now, one of those parks is our own Cape Cod National Seashore, which was brought into being in August of 1961. So I urge this generation of Americans, who are the fathers and mothers of 350 million Americans who will live in this country in the year 2000. And I want those Americans who live here in 2000 to feel that those of us who had positions of responsibility in the 60s did our part, and those of us who inherited it from Franklin Roosevelt and Theodore Roosevelt will have something to pass on to those who come and our children many years from now. So I hope that we will all harness our rivers. I hope we will reclaim our land. I hope we will irrigate it. I hope we can provide, through cooperative effort of the farmers and the government, the kind of program which will give them a hope for security. I hope, in other words, that we will take this rich country of ours, given to us by God and nature, and improve it through science and find new uses for our natural resources to make it possible for us to sustain in this country a steadily increasing standard of living, the highest in the world, and based on that powerful fortress to move out around the world in defense of freedom, as we have done for 18 years and as we must do in the years to come. This is the responsibility which this generation of Americans has been given. Thank you. And if you missed the point he's making is that we now have responsibility to our future generations, just like he in the 1960s saw a responsibility to us in the 2000s. Our next speaker is going to be Juliette Kayyem.
Before I get to the reading and my comments about it, I should say, as the daughter of immigrant parents or immigrant family from Lebanon, it's no coincidence that mine and my brother's initials are JK. That what it meant to immigrant families to have that family there. My mother from Lebanon, we used to play a game, 21 questions. Some of you will remember it in cars. You know, someone would have a subject and you had to guess what it is. Every single time it was either Eleanor Roosevelt or Jackie Kennedy. So she was an easy pick. I should also say my husband, who's standing there, who's now a judge, when he was a law professor, helped Ted Kennedy, Senator Ted Kennedy, with some legal issues. And when he told Senator Kennedy about my family's ties, at least in our head, to the Kennedys, Ted Kennedy picked up the phone immediately and called my mother to thank her for her support. It's those gestures that made the Kennedy, not just John Kennedy, but the Kennedy family such a remarkable one. They viewed service not as a burden, but of course as a privilege that they shared with all of us. This is from June 26, 1963, before the Rudolfplatz in Berlin. And you're going to excuse my German at the end. Freedom has many difficulties and democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us. I want to say on behalf of all my countrymen who live many miles away on the other side of the Atlantic, who are far distant from you, that they take the greatest pride that they have been able to share with you, even from a distance, the story of the last 18 years. I know of no town, no city that has been besieged for 18 years that still lives with the vitality and the force and the hope and the determination of the city of West Berlin. While the wall is the most obvious and vivid demonstration of the failures of the communist system for all the world to see, we take no satisfaction in it. For it is, as your mayor has said, an offense not only against history, but an offense against humanity, separating families, dividing husbands and wives and brothers and sisters, and dividing a people who wish to be joined together. What is true of the city is also true of Germany. Real, lasting peace in Europe can never be assured as long as 1 German out of 4 is denied the elementary right of free men, and that it is to make a choice. In 18 years of peace and good faith, this generation of Germans has earned the right to be free, including the right to unite their families and their nation in lasting peace with goodwill to all people. You live in a defended island of freedom, but your life is part of the main. So let me ask you as I close to lift your eyes beyond the dangers of today, to the hopes of tomorrow, beyond the freedom merely of the city of Berlin or your country of Germany, to the advance of freedom everywhere, beyond the wall to the day of peace with justice, beyond yourselves and ourselves to all mankind. Freedom is indivisible, and when one man is enslaved, all are not free. When all are free, then we can look forward to that day when this city will be joined as one, and this country and this great continent of Europe in a peaceful and hopeful globe. When that day finally comes, as it will, the people of West Berlin can take sober satisfaction in the fact that they were in the front lines for almost 2 decades. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin, and therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner. These words from Kennedy have greater meaning today than we could have imagined even a year ago. For all of the commentary about this speech, I read it this weekend with a sense of urgency that I had never felt before. It is ultimately a speech not about Berlin specifically, but about the post-World War II order that guided so much of Kennedy's thinking and the policies of our great nation until recently. It is pro-human rights, pro-democracy. It is also pro-Europe. It is an understanding, as Kennedy certainly would have felt with the sacrifices he made in service and the ultimate sacrifice of his brother, that if the wars we fought in the 20th century are to have any meaning, it was beyond the freedom merely of the city of Berlin, beyond the war to the day of peace with justice, beyond yourselves and ourselves to all mankind. It is difficult for me to stand before you today and not warn of the challenges to that peace with justice that we are confronting today. Movements on the left and right, some fair, reminding that too many have been left behind, some reeking of the same hatred and ideology that animated in Kennedy's time, are challenging the core of Kennedy's vision. In the name of disruption, they believe that the order that Kennedy dreamed of, that the great continent of Europe would be a vision of peace and hope, is quaint and has served its time. And in that process, America's role in nurturing that vision is being viewed as obsolete or outdated. So with you here today, I do not apologize, as I have JFK's words as my backing. Berlin is as relevant today as it was then. Our nation cannot afford to abandon the post-World War order that has served us well. Imperfect at times, of course, but it has, through fits and starts, elevated man and womankind, demanded greater access to voting and participation, and has kept us from the brutality and death of mass destruction. There was a time, as Kennedy said in this excerpt, when American took the greatest pride in sharing that vision. That vision has been questioned by our own citizens, our European allies in NATO and the EU. And our political leaders fail to recommit to that common vision will leave us less safe and will leave Europe susceptible to the very forces that have brought so much havoc in the past. I do not pretend that the world is without its challenges. I work in that world. The challenges we face are new: terror, pandemics, climate change, cyber attacks. Some are old and familiar, as Kennedy certainly knew: Russia, authoritarianism, anti-Semitism, anti-immigrant sentiment. But that means that we need to recommit to Kennedy's words, to our institutions that have actually served us well. Disruption is not intrinsically good, and the institutions that Kennedy spoke of are not intrinsically bad. Freedom, as he said in that speech, has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect. But it is the institutions of governance and world order, ones that Kennedy lived by and nurtured, that will give the greatest joy and freedoms for the future. As he said, we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us. The brutality and short-sightedness of any wall to keep us in or to keep those who might thrive here will, I believe, prove as damning as the Berlin Wall did. And so as we honor Kennedy, let us also remember the fierce urgency of now. His legacy is not static. It is under tremendous stress. We must continue to nurture the vision that is likely his greatest foreign policy accomplishment, that Europe and America, as friends, as cousins, will together provide a lasting peace and goodwill to all. Let us, if not as government policy, but as individuals with collective influence, remember his words. Recommit to Berlin and what it represented to our great President Kennedy. The commitment to a lasting peace brought by a shared vision between the U.S. and our European cousins. For Kennedy's memory and for his vision, we are all Berliners today.
I want to thank our speakers, our readers and speakers, excuse me. I seem to be losing my voice. It perhaps is the right moment before we go much further to speak of the fact that we have here today a number of consuls general or their representatives. And I'd like to recognize them if they're all here, and even if they're not, they intended to be, and say that one of the things that has been most striking to us about this small house is the very large number of international visitors that it draws. The social science surveyors who look at different national parks and figure out what their visitors are all about were quite surprised about this, and they haven't been here for a long time, and I can tell you that it's our impression that the numbers of foreign visitors continues to grow. So what it is about Kennedy that so many years later is still a source of inspiration is something of enormous interest to us, and something I think we all should be proud of. So if I could, I'd like to recognize these individuals who are here today, and I'd like to apologize in advance for what is almost guaranteed to be poor pronunciation. We'll start with the easy one. Here we go. The Honorable David Alward, Consul General of Canada. The Honorable Rokichiro Nichi, the Consul General of Japan. Leonardo Lavalle, Consul for Academic and Economic Affairs, Mexico. And the Honorable Harriet Cross, Consul General of the United Kingdom. It means a great deal to us that you've joined us today. I'm wondering if the Postmaster of Boston is in the house?
Yes.
Wonderful. And I know that Rose Fennell is in the house. And there she is. Rose Fennell is the Deputy Regional Director of the National Park Service. And we're going to have a stamp unveiling, which is kind of fun and exciting. And I want everyone to go out and buy a lot of Kennedy stamps, because it is something we can do every day if you still pay your bills by mail. It's a forever stamp. Something we can do every day to signify our loyalty to Brookline and its native sons. Maintaining that legacy is something I think we all wish to be part of. So, this is your place.
Great. Well, good afternoon. My name's Nick Franciscucci. I'm the Postmaster of Boston.
I'm proud to be here representing the United States Postal Service on today, the 100th birthday of John F. Kennedy. It's hard to believe John F. Kennedy would have been 100 years old today. Thinking back when he was elected as 35th president and 43 years old, charismatic, full of passion about positive change in our country, he was inspiration for so many young Americans in changing them into public service. His accomplishments were many, some of which were the Peace Corps, the goal of sending the first American to space, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He accomplished so much in his short life. With that being said, today we have two previously issued stamps to depict moments of JFK's legacy. The first one is the Alan Shepard stamp, first American in space. The second is the Peace Corps stamp, which established Kennedy's on the ideals of helping others and giving back. I'm excited today to present this beautiful stamp. It's a picture taken in 1960 by Ted Siegel. And when you look at the picture, you can see President Kennedy's vigor for life as he looks up as a positive manner into the sky, and you can just tell he's going to do great things. So with that, I'd like to ask Rose Fennell and Congressman Joe Kennedy to come up and help me unveil the stamp.
Down in front, please. Down in front, please.
By the way, to memorialize today, we have cachets to be installed right inside here at the bookstore for $5. In addition to that, I have a presentation piece. I'd like to present Joe Kennedy with a presentation piece to remember the day. Whoa.
So thank you, Mr. Franzicucci. The National Park Service enjoys a very special relationship with the United States Postal Service and appreciates the many occasions over the years and around the country in which the Postal Service has honored our parks with special commemorative stamps. Locally, you have honored the Longfellow National Historic Site on the occasion of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's 200th birthday in 2007, and the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site in 1999, with a stamp honoring the achievements of that great landscape architect. Both occasions included special unveilings at park events. Thank you for the plaque, which we will display with pride in our visitor center here at the park. I'd like at this time to introduce Mr. Neil Wyszynski, Chairman of the Brookline Board of Selectmen.
Thank you. I have the privilege to welcome you here on behalf of the town of Brookline for the celebration of President Kennedy's birth. Brookline was President Kennedy's original hometown, and the town has been hosting a series of events, this event being one of the highlights. And I'd like to thank the town's JFK 100 Celebration Committee. First, Selectman Nancy Heller, the Honorable Nancy Gertner and John Reinstein, Jim Solomon, Fireplace Restaurant, Chobe Hoy, and Betsy DeWitt. E.J. Dionne wrote in today's Washington Post that it's fitting that we honor the 100th anniversary of JFK's birth on Memorial Day, which salutes those who died for their country. Kennedy and his moment in history was shaped by the experiences of the greatest generation of which he was a part. World War II veterans developed a deep confidence in the capacity of Americans to act in common, unquote. President Kennedy embodied that confidence and that capacity to collectively solve the national problems. President Kennedy reminds us of the power of words, ideas, and how they're delivered. In the last hour, we heard so many examples of this. Particularly inspiring to me was the Civil Rights Address, which Justice Gertner and Mr. Reinstein quoted. And those words ring true today, as well as other, for those issues and for others. And I think it's worth quoting again a passage. We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country and a people. It cannot be met by regressive police actions. It cannot be left to increase demonstrations in the streets. It cannot be quieted by token moves or talk. It's a time to act in the Congress, in your state and local legislative body, and above all, in our daily lives. It's not enough to pin the blame on others, to say this is a problem of one section of the country or another, or deplore the facts that we face. A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all. Those who do nothing are inviting shame as well as violence. Those who act boldly are recognizing right as well as reality. The memory of this kind of oratory and leadership inspires me, and I hope you, to work to raise the level of local and national political discourse. Yes, ideas matter, and how they're presented matter. And the moral compass of our leaders matter, not only to us, but to the world and our place in the world. So on behalf of the Brookline Board of Selectmen and my colleagues, Ben Franco, Nancy Heller, Bernard Green, and Heather Hamilton, I welcome you. And our next speaker is Mr. Roberts.
Let me bring up this is a beautiful thing. I'll leave it up here for others to see. Just have a couple of words before she gets started. It's wonderful to see all of these people here. It's very exciting. And it's nice that you wish to be here and you don't want to absolutely have to go in the house this minute. We have a wonderful staff here at the Kennedy site. We're so fortunate that we do. And what we wanted to do was to spend some time, we now have the speeches in the rearview mirror. I mean, I hope not permanently. I hope they find their way into our lives and into our culture. But we wish to move into some time about the young Kennedy, which is very much our focus at this site. Then we will also, one of our prime goals is to engage youth in the Kennedy story. And we will have some representatives from younger generations. We will hear briefly from Jacqueline via a poem. And then we will, I believe, if Mr. Frederick Logobal is here, we will have the benefit of his commentary on Kennedy's presidency. He's in the throes of researching and writing a new and fresh biography of JFK. And finally, we'll be able to hear from another Kennedy. And I know we're all looking forward to that and to hearing from our representative, Joe Kennedy III. So let me introduce Jim Roberts. He is our supervisor partner in JFK. Oh, I did? Okay.
I have to admit, I have not memorized it. Thank you, Superintendent Harrison, invited guests, friends and neighbors and visitors as well. What was it, 53 years ago today, there was a crowd, not unlike this one, but for a very different occasion, on the National Day of Mourning. And once again, we gather here in front of this house to commemorate and celebrate JFK's life. As Myra mentioned, we're going to be talking more about JFK and his boyhood, and I've been asked to speak specifically to that. During his boyhood years in Brookline, John Fitzgerald Kennedy faced several challenges. This historic neighborhood and site reveal many details about the challenges young John F. Kennedy encountered during his boyhood years in Brookline. Through determination, imagination, humor, and family support, he was able to transform his challenges into opportunities, establishing a foundation in character that led him to become the 35th President of the United States. Now, it is important to preserve places that tell us about stories from the past. The National Park Service's caring for these sites today provides future generations with an opportunity to learn from them. Young John F. Kennedy lived in a very different time. His mother, Rose Kennedy, wanted her children to know and feel the past. She carefully chose all of the objects on display in the home that you'll see today to say something about the time when the Kennedy family lived at 83 Beale Street. Some aspects of their life in Brookline are strikingly different, but some are remarkably similar. Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy held high expectations for their children. Family meals were often eaten together, and the Kennedy children were expected to arrive to dinner on time and learn proper dinner manners. From a very early age, the children were expected to participate in conversation, share experiences from the day, listen, ask questions, answer thoughtfully, speak up, and communicate ideas and thoughts with the rest of the group. Mrs. Kennedy said she encouraged an exchange of information and ideas in which even the younger children learned to speak for themselves. Topics included items from the religious calendar, Sunday Mass, current events, history, and daily activities. And family activities were a vital component of the Kennedys' life. Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy stressed the importance of reading, homework, music, art, and religion, and felt that involvement in these activities would give their children the necessary skills to become successful adults. The President's parents also stressed participation in family activities and putting the family first. In the living room, the family gathered to read and play, say their nightly prayers, and listen or play the piano. These activities were important to the Kennedy family and done on a regular basis. Jack, as he was called by his friends and family, and three of his siblings, Joe Jr., Rosemary, and Kathleen, lived in this home. At the time, it was customary for children to be born at home, and Jack, Kathleen, and Rosemary were born here. Jack was the second of 9 children, and he was a compassionate, patient, and humorous older brother. Rosemary was born with intellectual disability that made learning difficult. This made the family think about life in a new way, and evoked compassion in the children of a very privileged family. As the 2 oldest siblings, Joe Jr. and Jack, were expected to be role models for the younger children. But Joe Jr. was less patient with Jack than with the other siblings, and although they cared for one another dearly, they were fiercely competitive with each other. Their personalities differed greatly. Joe Jr. was firstborn, filled with vitality, healthy, and energy. He was serious and ambitious, neat and orderly. He emanated power and promise and was expected to be a role model for younger children. Joe Jr. took on that responsibility and, as his mother would say, acted like a little adult. Jack, on the other hand, was warm and playful, but often tardy, forgetful, and sloppy. He was quite intelligent, had an active imagination, and surpassed Joe Jr. in mental ability, but was lazy in school. Even though Joe Jr. was bigger and stronger, Jack wouldn't let that stop him. He never gave up. As a younger and smaller brother, Jack often tried to prove that just because Joe Jr. was older didn't mean he was better. As the smaller and weaker brother, Jack often tried to challenge Joe Jr. The older and bigger brother, Joe Jr., would usually win, but Jack was relentless. Mrs. Kennedy recalled on a sunny afternoon one spring, Joe suggested a bicycle race, with each going around the block in opposite directions. Approaching each other head-on at the final corner, neither boy swerved. The collision left Joe unhurt, but Jack was thrown from his bike into the air, coming down on the ground in a bloody heap that would take 28 stitches to put together again. And Jack endured many illnesses as a boy. He dealt with the challenge of always being sick by reading and using his imagination to escape with characters in his story. Various illnesses plagued him throughout his life, but he was never defeated by them. Mrs. Kennedy spoke of the pleasure of reading to Jack as a boy and how reading helped him develop a strong imagination. During his presidency, he imagined sending a man to the moon, imagined a country where all people are treated equally, imagined the removal of the Berlin Wall and unifying the people of Germany, imagined a program, the Peace Corps, that helped people around the world. His two favorite books were Billy Whiskers, a story of a naughty, playful, and mischievous goat, and King Arthur and his Knights, the legend of a heroic king who helped his people. Other books he enjoyed reading were the Tales of the Arabian Nights, Peter Pan, Bambi, Black Beauty, Treasure Island, Kidnapped, The Jungle Book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, The Lays of Ancient Rome, Pilgrim's Progress, and The Story of a Bad Boy. Jack was encouraged to participate in sports, and although he wasn't a strong boy, he was a fighter and always put forth great effort. Mrs. Kennedy said, "My husband was quite a strict father. He liked the boys to win at sports and everything they tried. If they didn't win, he would discuss their failure with them, but he did not have much patience with the loser." Although Jack grew up in a different time, he encountered similar childhood challenges of today. He and his older brother challenged one another. He was constantly battling sickness. His parents held high expectations for all their children and enforced family rules. These challenges were difficult, but through determination, imagination, and a good sense of humor, he overcame many of them. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Rebecca Soto, who's going to give us her perspective of what JFK means to her.
What JFK means to me. Did you know that John Fitzgerald Kennedy lived in Brookline, Massachusetts, right around where I live? Did you know that John Fitzgerald Kennedy lived in Brookline, Massachusetts, right around where I live? He lived in a small house with the rest of his family. I think the most interesting thing I learned about JFK is that he went into politics and became president, even though he didn't plan to. I would not expect such a mischievous boy to become president. For example, JFK was always late for dinner. Whenever he was late, he had to answer questions from the newspaper. The newspaper man always came to his house because his family liked to read so much. Do you think a boy who's always late to dinner would be future president? Another example is that JFK wasn't always such a good role model like his mother wanted him to be. One day, JFK was taking a family photo in fancy clothes, but he had his collar messed up and his shoes untied and he looked like a big mess. And yet, he became the president. Finally, JFK didn't get very good grades in school. In school, he didn't get good grades in public speaking, math, and a lot of other things. When you are president, you have to do a lot of public speaking. When JFK did public speaking, he did pretty well. So he must have learned sometime because he did pretty good, which is really weird. So remember that JFK taught us things can happen that you didn't plan to happen. For example, right now I'm bad at putting punctuation in my sentences. But maybe that will change in the future when I get older. Thanks.
Readjust the microphone a bit. Rebecca's part of our annual program called what JFK Means to Me, which is a partnership with the town of Brookline and Edward Devotion School. And every year we get to hear wonderful essays like that. It's always a treat. We just did that last week. Unfortunately, it was a much worse day as far as weather, and we had to go inside for that. Also, we have an annual program called the Stewards of the Future, where we hire high school students from the local area for an 8-week summer program where they can get an internship and learn about careers in federal government, in the National Park Service specifically. And today we have with us one of our alumnus from last year, who is a success story in that, is it next week? Next week he will become a park ranger with the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation. So please welcome Peter Scherer.
Hopefully that holds. I would like to thank my former supervisor, Jim Roberts, for giving me the opportunity to speak today. It is truly an honor to stand at this podium on this very special day and reflect on what JFK means to me. Over the course of my employment at the John Fitzgerald Kennedy National Historic Site last summer, I gained an understanding of our nation's 35th president as a person. At the beginning of the summer, as a rising high school senior who had studied U.S. history sophomore year, I knew the basics about JFK that were necessary for a standardized test. I could associate with his name such phrases as the space race, or the Cuban Missile Crisis, or the Peace Corps, or the Bay of Pigs. But there is no place better than someone's childhood home to get to know them on a more personal level. When I first toured the house, I saw the picture taken just a few yards from here almost a century ago that shows Joe Jr. squeezing young Jack's hand as they pose for a picture on Easter Sunday. Jack is motioning towards the person taking the photo that his older brother is hurting him, but apparently to no avail. As a younger brother myself, I recollected times when I found myself in similar scenarios. When we entered the house, I saw the tiny chair and miniature table where young Jack used to eat meals. I saw his crib, his christening gown, his children's books, his teddy bear. At the beginning of the summer, it was difficult to reconcile this intensely personal view of the president's childhood with my image of him as an adult. How could someone whining about their hand being squeezed by their brother go on to be a war hero? How could someone reading Billy Whiskers, the autobiography of a mischievous goat, eventually defuse the Cuban Missile Crisis? Obviously, there is a major difference between the capabilities of a 3-year-old and a 45-year-old, but one thing is continuous: their identity as a person. It can be easy to inflate people like JFK to be somehow on a different realm from the rest of us, given their intelligence, composure, and eloquence. But it only takes a closer look at someone to understand that they are simply a person who was once a little kid, just like the rest of us. They hope and fear and succeed and fail just like we do. To me, JFK is Jack, born in my hometown. He was pushed around by his older brother, read whimsical books, and snuggled with a teddy bear. He was also the 35th President of the United States and a war hero. But this site has taught me that he was a person above all, just like all of us. And just like him, we can all strive to make positive change in the world. Thank you. and I would now like to introduce lead park ranger Jason Atzelis.
John F. Kennedy understood the importance of words and the enriching power that art plays in our lives. He once said that if more politicians knew poetry and more poets knew politics, I am convinced the world would be a little better place in which to live. He and First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy brought elegance and eloquence to the White House, and I would now like to read a poem that Jackie wrote for her husband just after the two were married in 1953. Meanwhile in Massachusetts, Jack Kennedy dreamed, walking the shore by the Cape Cod Sea, of all the things he was going to be. He breathed in the tang of the New England fall, and back in his mind he pictured it all. The burnished New England countryside, names that a patriot says with pride, Concord and Lexington, Bunker Hill, Plymouth and Falmouth and Marston's Mill, Winthrop and Salem, Lowell, Revere, Quincy and Cambridge, Louisburg Square. This was his heritage, this was his share of dreams that a young man harks in the air. The past reached out and tracked him now. He would heed that touch, he didn't know how. Part he must serve, a part he must lead. Both were his calling, both were his need. Part he was of New England stock, as stubborn, close-guarded as Plymouth Rock. He thought with his feet most firm on the ground, but in his heart and his dreams were not earthbound. He would call New England his place and his creed, but part he was of an alien breed. Of a breed that had laughed on Irish hills and heard the voices in Irish rills. The lilt of that green land danced in his blood, Tara, Killarney, a magical flood, that surged in the depth of his too proud heart and spiked the punch of New England so tart. Men would call him thoughtful, sincere. They would not see through to the last cavalier. He turned on the beach and looked toward his house. On a green lawn his white house stands, and the wind blows, the seagrass low on the sands. There his brothers and sisters have laughed and played and thrown themselves to rest in the shade. The lights glowed inside. Soon supper would ring, and he would go home where his father was king. But now he was here with the wind and the sea and all of the things he was going to be. He would build empires, and he would have sons. Others would fall where the current runs. He would find love. He would never find peace, for he must go seeking the golden fleece. Of all of the things he was going to be, all of the things in the wind and the sea. I now have the pleasure of introducing Frederick Logeval. He's from the Lawrence Steve Belfer Professor of International Affairs at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University.
It's great to be with you on this occasion. My name is Frederick Logeval. I am a historian at Harvard, where, by the way, I just want to mention there is in the Harvard Archives a new exhibit. Some of you have seen it. If you have not, I want to recommend it to you. It's in the Pusey Library, and they have found wonderful materials pertaining to the president's time at Harvard, and some of you have even heard a clip that they uncovered, which is from 1937. JFK was in a public speaking course taught by Professor Frederick Packard, and it was English F. This is 1937. So it's either in the spring of his freshman year or early in his sophomore year. And it's in really terrific shape. So I just recommend to you the exhibit and also that particular tape. And I think it gives a sense, I hope, of why this president, this leader of the United States, continues to fascinate us. It's why I think it certainly helps explain why I'm writing a biography of John F. Kennedy. We're getting really new stuff, is the point. And the holdings at the Kennedy Library down the street are terrific. We have wonderful things at Harvard, the Mass Historical Society. There is so much material to work with, and I'm working on it as we speak. And it's a fascinating life that we're discussing here today, taking us from 1917, of course, in his birth, to that fateful day in Dallas in November of 1963. 46 years. 46 years in which the United States rose to the pinnacle of power in the world, in which JFK occupied the Oval Office for some of the tensest times in human history. And I want to tell that story in my book. And I want to talk just in my few minutes today about a particular connection that I would like to draw between his childhood and his presidency. There are many of those kinds of connections that we can make, and I want to talk about one in particular. We're talking about here his historical sensibility that he had from an early age. Long before he became president, John F. Kennedy showed an appreciation for the vicissitudes of history, for the vagaries of history, for its capacity to surprise, for its indeterminacy. Other historians, other presidents I should say, have had this historical discernment. Woodrow Wilson is the only one who comes to mind who would equal John F. Kennedy, it seems to me, in the last century. And even Wilson, I would suggest, doesn't quite have the same grounding in history that John F. Kennedy had. And I think this is how we can connect his childhood here in Brookline to his presidency many years later. He had this sensibility, it seems to me, from an early age. He was sick, as we've heard today, and bedridden for long stretches of his youth. And he devoured history books. He devoured biographies of great men, especially British ones, I think. And he read quickly, as we know. And he had a fantastic recall. One of the things you see when you study John F. Kennedy is the degree to which he can recall quotes, even late in life, from books that he read as a teenager. His senior thesis at Harvard, later published, of course, as Why England Slept, was a penetrating work of contemporary history. I recently had a chance to compare the thesis with the book, and in fact they're remarkably similar. And though he had some assistance in terms of gathering documents and materials for this thesis, it was a work written by, I'm convinced, John F. Kennedy himself. It's I think, a remarkably mature piece of work, especially when you consider that he was in his early 20s when he wrote it. And of course the book, as I think you all know, chronicles, assesses why British leaders made the choices they made in the lead up to World War II. It also represents, by the way, a certain distancing between, a certain break, if you will, between JFK's worldview and that of his father, Joseph Kennedy. His later books, Profiles in Courage and the book A Nation of Immigrants, likewise it seems to me, have a historical basis from which they proceed. So this undergirds what John F. Kennedy does as a writer, as a thinker. And this is what a historical awareness does. By pulling us away from our natural tendency towards self-centeredness, it broadens our horizons, heightens our awareness of the likely consequences of our actions, which is the beginning of maturity and wisdom. Kennedy had that. He understood, it seems to me, that history is our collective memory, which means that without history, we are amnesiacs, with little or no sense of where we might go, how we got where we are, and where we might be heading. If you read his speeches today, and there's a marvelous new collection that was brought together by Stephen Kennedy Smith, his nephew, and then he also selected people to write essays alongside these speeches. This has just been published. He had Douglas Brinkley along as a co-editor, but if you read those speeches collected in that book, you get a sense, it seems to me, of how Kennedy draws his audience's attentions to America's moral instincts and traditions, to her past trials and accomplishments, to the deep and time-honored interconnections between the United States and the rest of the world. And I want to just say a few minutes, or just a few things here as I close, about a particular instance, it seems to me, in which Kennedy's historical sensibility mattered most. And that, of course, is the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, when the world stood on the brink of nuclear annihilation, and when John F. Kennedy, and this is important, stood virtually alone among his advisors in insisting on the need to find a political solution. Here, I want to submit to you this afternoon, he showed the judgment that comes from studying the past, including our mistakes, and the wisdom to admit those mistakes and learn from them. I think it's extremely important in terms of the resolution of the crisis which he insisted upon. This skepticism, it seems to me, goes back to his own service in World War II. His skepticism regarding the use of military force and the utility of military force, and a growing conviction in the years after his service in World War II that in the nuclear age, it would be calamitous to have great power war. Such a war must be avoided at all costs. I think this drives John F. Kennedy's decision-making in the crisis. And I think, as has often been said, John F. Kennedy was at his best during those 13 days of the crisis. He showed, and I think this is something else that he exhibited from an early age, he showed an empathetic understanding in the crisis. He was able to put himself into the shoes of Nikita Khrushchev, his Soviet counterpart, to try to imagine things from the situation from Khrushchev's perspective. And that's what empathy is. It means understanding the thoughts and feelings of others. It's to be distinguished from sympathy, a word with which it's often confused, which is defined as, I think, as feeling with others, as being in agreement with them. Empathy, you can in other words have without being in agreement with somebody, and this is something that Kennedy understood. He understood that it does not require warmth or approval, but only realistic understanding. It seems to me this is powerful stuff, ladies and gentlemen. It is because we realize that life presents challenges to even the most fortunate among us, that we are all flawed and vulnerable, that life is precious and must be treated with respect, that we're able to reach out empathetically to acknowledge our connections with our fellow human beings, and to emphasize, to empathize. To empathize, in short, is to civilize. Finally, just one quote from a speech that he did not get a chance to give. This was a speech slated for the Dallas Trade Mart on November 22nd, 1963. In this speech, he does something that I think you'll agree has contemporary resonance, because John F. Kennedy, had he been able to give that speech, would have insisted on the absolute need for rational, fact-based discourse in public life. Here is what he said, and I'm going to leave you with this, or again, what he would have said. It's an absolutely remarkable passage to my mind. Dallas Trade Mart, November 22nd, 1963. In a world of complex and continuing problems, in a world full of frustrations and irritations, America's leadership must be guided by learning and reason, or else those who confuse rhetoric with reality and the plausible with the possible will gain popular ascendancy, and with their seemingly swift and simple solutions to every world problem. We cannot expect that everyone will talk sense to the American people, but we can hope that fewer people will listen to this nonsense. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And we look forward to the publication of your carrying on his family's commitment to public service. Congressman Joe Kennedy III is in his third term representing the 4th District of Massachusetts. And we in the National Park Service are proud to have 3 parks in his district: the Olmsted Home, the Kennedy Home, and the New Bedford Whaling National Historical Park. and we have appreciated your support and your excellent service that your office provides. We want to thank you for co-sponsoring the legislation creating the JFK Commission, and knowing that you personally experienced the impact of President Kennedy's legacy through your service in the Peace Corps. Joe Kennedy, please.
So this is essentially a family gathering. It's about as many people around a Thanksgiving table. So to the extent possible, the rain is starting to come down a little bit more. If people can squeeze in, there are some little young folks outside in the rain. So if they can at least kind of squeeze in and fill in the empty seats, that would be appreciated, I'm sure, for everybody that's getting wet on a beautiful, almost June afternoon in New England. To start, Professor Wogelwall, thank you. I don't know where you are. Thank you for your extraordinary words. Thank you for the message on which you ended. We actually met, like many of my interactions at the moment, in an airport on a delayed flight a couple of weeks ago. And I'm really, Professor, honored that you'd be willing to be here today. Thank you. To the National Park Service, to the town of Brookline, to an untold number of dear friends that are gathered here today, I cannot find words to say thank you for a thoughtful and poignant tribute to my great uncle. It is hard for me to tell you how meaningful this is for me, for my family, so suffice it to say, at least for now, that we all are deeply, deeply grateful. As many of you know, this occasion is particularly powerful for me because I used to live, like, literally right next door. My wife and I brought our first child home right around the corner to the house that we shared as a family. We moved to try to find a little bit more space for all of the strollers. But this neighborhood, this community, all of you will always hold a very special chapter in our lives. And ladies and gentlemen, there's been an incredible outpouring of inspiring words that have been shared about my great uncle in the months, the weeks, and the days leading up to his centennial. When you have a family that is as big as mine, you learn pretty quickly that you can't speak for any of them, let alone all of them. But I think I can safely say the few words resonate as deeply to any of us as the ones that come from here. From Brookline, from Boston, from Massachusetts, from home. Because if there's one thing that we know about President John F. Kennedy, it's how proud he was of where he came from. His family, his heritage, and his hometown. This bold, and sometimes, almost always, beautiful Commonwealth. This brilliant country, which gave his ancestors the opportunities that dreams are made of. That pride wove and wound its way through everything he did. In the voice of a man who delivered sweeping prose with a sharp Boston accent. The heart of a man who traveled from sea to shining sea, yet found no match for the magic of Cape Cod shores. No substitute for the wisdom of an Irish Catholic mother. No equal to his beloved city on a hill. President Kennedy's pride was honest and sure-footed. It was expansive, inclusive, and infectious. And it's a feeling that most of us know, that we can relate to. when you are so hungry to be a part of something, when you offer a piece of yourself to a person, to a place, to a cause because you believe in it so deeply, when you care about something enough that you will give it your everything, and then search from the bottom of your soul to give it a little bit more. When pride becomes your purpose. And no one understood that as instinctively as John F. Kennedy. It was a lesson of a lifetime from a boy who made his way from the dining room table of a big Irish family to the bunks and brotherhood of the United States Navy, to the tight-knit chambers of the U.S. Senate, all the way to the helm of a messy, mighty, melting pot of a country. Our stories are linked. I cannot separate my fate from yours. Your despair is mine. My triumph, yours. But it wasn't just blind buy-in to the common good for the young president, for he offered us something in return. He was not the only president who implored a generation to serve. He was the president who promised us a country worthy of our service. A nation fearless enough to conquer the moon. A government confident enough to carry our weak on its shoulders. A system fair enough that no man, woman, or child would be told that they matter less than a neighbor. And a citizenry determined enough that they would offer themselves as ambassadors to peace to the darkest corners of our globe. And it worked. A generation jumped off the sidelines and raced to be part of it all, inspired by a president who told them that he needed them, that their country, their communities needed them on the field, that none of us can do it alone, and that he would gratefully accept whatever it is that any of us had to offer, no matter how big or how small. Today, we search for that patriotism and that common cause. There are moments where we see it, surely, in the lives we honor each Memorial Day. And the heroes that continue to put themselves on the front line so that the rest of us live safe and free. And those songs and flags, the slogans and the holidays, the symbols, yes, but important reminders of a shared history that binds us all as a community, a commonwealth, and a country truly together. But our shared future, right now, may feel tenuous. Today, our country faces those who seem intent on dividing Americans up rather than pulling us together. One system for the powerful, the wealthy, and the healthy. Another for the sick, the struggling, the suffering. One country for those who pray to a certain God, love a certain person, or look a certain way. And another, lesser, weaker nation for everyone else. It's hard for many of us to be proud of that vision. But it is in times of doubt and division that this centennial reminds us of our collective saving grace. That same surety that underscored President Kennedy's enduring faith in the capability of our nation. That human beings are exceptional. That our simple existence crowns our universe. That we are imperfect, we are flawed, we are fragile. We can be selfish and petty and cruel. But, and this he believed in so fiercely, in the moments that matter most, we exceed our expectations. We expand and we extend. We rescue, we protect, we survive. We open, we give, we heal, and we help. We choose to be heroes to a loved one, to a stranger, to a cause, and to a country. And that inherent characteristic inside every one of us, more than any law or any leader, one of the most powerful movements or moments, is what drives us towards progress. It takes time and persistence and resistance and patience. But no single person, no bully, no stubborn monster like prejudice or injustice, in the end, none of it can match the small, personal, courageous ways that Americans, that we choose goodness every single day. Because we all want to be proud of how we spend this precious time on earth. We all want our children to be proud of us. We all want our lives to have mattered. President Kennedy knew that was true about each of us. He spoke it, he lived it, and an inspired nation continues to rise to his challenge today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for honoring my great uncle.
Thank you, Congressman, for those very inspiring remarks and for helping us recognize the importance of place and home. And in that vein, the National Park Service will continue to steward this great home, and we will continue to work in partnership with the citizens of Brookline. Thank you very much for your support over the years, and we look forward to continuing to work with you. I'd like to close out by having someone come forward who I think will help us bring home and exemplify
Down in front.
President Kennedy's call to service. This is where the rubber meets the road. And so I'd like to recognize Superintendent Myra Harrison, who yesterday performed 45 years of public service to her country. Years in one day. So that concludes our program. We'd like to ask folks to stick around. We have entertainment coming from the music school, a flute ensemble of the Brookline Music School. Thank you.
Sure.